Okay, so hello and welcome to ISG Smart Talks, the podcast where we discuss the many and varied ways that technology is transforming the world of business. Our objective with every episode is to educate, to simplify, and also to inspire. We'll take a look at different subjects each episode, and we'll look at how the technology is helping to transform the world of business. So today, our topic is sourcing, the world of outsourcing, and sourcing in what is now a digital and agile world. So we'll look at how the outsourcing industry is being transformed by digital technologies, new ways of partnering, contracting, different commercial models, different ways of working, what's changed, what hasn't changed yet, what's good, what's difficult, challenges and opportunities. And today we have a real sourcing expert with us, someone who's seen many changes over the years as he's worked on and managed large and complex outsourcing arrangements, and particularly the contractual side of arrangements, because I'm very pleased to welcome Kit Burden, who's partner at law firm DLA Piper, and a bit of a legend of the legal side of outsourcing deals. So Kit, do you want to introduce yourself?
You're very kind, Barry. I'm not often described as a legend anywhere outside my own confines of my own head, but thank you very much for that kind introduction.
Tell us how you first got involved in outsourcing.
Well, it's funny. It was kind of by accident, if I'm honest. So I guess if I go back around about 30 years now to when I first qualified, and although I'd had a background of studying IT law at university, the firm that I first qualified into wasn't known for that. In fact, to be fair, there wasn't any such thing as IT law in a recognised sense then. And so I was a litigator, and I was doing, funnily enough, mostly professional indemnity defence work. So I was defending solicitors and the like for when they were being sued for negligence. But one of the very first big cases that I was asked to act as an associate for was an insured claim, but it was a negligence claim against what was then Pricewaterhouse and Pricewaterhouse Management Consulting. So it was one of the, at that time, growing 30% year on year IT consultancies.
Yeah.
And through working with them on a couple of cases in quick succession, I must have done something quite right, because they decided that maybe rather than face these disputes, they should get their contracts done and risk management done correctly in the first place. And therefore they asked my then firm if they could have me as a sacrificial lamb as a secondee. Right. So when I went across there, believing actually that I was going to be doing risk management work and therefore still basically being a litigator, I found out that in actual fact what they were asking me to do was to do contract negotiation, because getting the contracts right in the first way was a far better way of managing risk at the end of the day. Yeah. And by the time I'd spent what ended up being a total of a year working in-house doing those types of contract negotiations on big kind of ERP deals and system integration projects predominantly, it would probably have been dangerous to have let me loose again on a litigation matter. So I stayed doing contract negotiation and then rapidly gravitated towards doing the larger and more complicated technology deals of the day, which obviously tended to be outsourcing. So I became ever more focused upon outsourcing engagements in particular.
Yeah, it's funny. So I don't think any of us chose probably as a career path after we'd qualified or graduated to actually go into outsourcing, but it's one of those industries that, you know, I probably got into it 20 odd years ago when it just became the way of delivering at the time. So cost reduction, transformation using external third parties. And so although we hadn't, I suppose, chosen it as a career path, if you got involved in it and you realized how it worked and you became adept at it, then you realized as a professional services provider, a consultancy or a legal firm, that once you knew how to do it and how to set up outsourcing deals well, offshoring deals well, how to make them work, how to put the right commercial and contractual models in place, then you could make a decent living, and there was a significant demand for expertise in a relatively new delivery model that wasn't working particularly well.
Completely right. I mean, I think we're all sometimes humble enough to realize how lucky we were to be in a particular place at a particular time. And I certainly would say that with outsourcing, because if I think back to the timeline, so initially when I was doing IT contracts, there was not only just the continuing capabilities of IT to underpin business, but also the impact of the Y2K problem, and therefore a huge upsurge in the demand for new systems and development and what have you. And if we cast our minds back, we'll remember that was one of the main shots in the arm to give the growth of the IT industry in India like a boost on steroids.
Yeah.
And that then led to the possibility of labor arbitrage-led deals coming to the market, which transformed outsourcing really from being something which was the preserve of more facilities management and only kind of very large-scale mainframe-based outsourcings for the likes of EDS, as was an IBM for very big corporates, just suddenly opening the doors to a whole host of initially application maintenance and development deals, but then increasingly remote hosting and support of infrastructure, and with telco capabilities improving so quickly over that same period to enable rapid transfers of sizable files of data. We were really seeing outsourcing growing at exponential rates. So we're just in the right, probably both of us were in the right place at the right time in terms of the growth and the demand for increasing the expert services to underpin that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think how those deal constructs have changed, so back in those days, it was probably, God, I remember putting in place 7 to 10 years as a sort of average length of a contractual relationship, and spending months and months defining very, very specific requirements, and then spending very many more months on service level regimes and performance management regimes. And we were very, very risk averse, I think, at the time. And it's interesting when you look back to how much that has changed now in this new digital world.
Completely. I mean, you still do see contracts which have got many of the disciplines of those types of contract, but you're absolutely right that with the advent of the cloud and obviously the changes then to the delivery model for the services, the imperative to move quickly so as to embrace DevOps and agile, it necessitates a change to the way that the deals are structured and then obviously contracted for as well. So whilst the old way of doing things hasn't gone completely, it certainly now sits alongside a very different way of working. Yeah,
I think, even the word outsourcing now, right, we don't really see it or hear it used as much as it used to be. It's all very much now about co-collaboration and co-innovation and partnership. And I think that's really important because I think there's been a symbolic change where customers now, clients looking for help, don't think they know everything themselves now. They don't define the challenge or the specific requirements that they're looking for and say, well, who's best placed to do it? They recognize that service providers bring an awful lot of intelligence and thinking to the table. Then they want to create things together. So, outsourcing is probably better replaced with, partnering or co-collaboration. But do you see that same sort of shift happening?
Yeah, certainly the terminology, I think, has changed. So partially that's because in some circles it's got perhaps more of a bad name that it deserves, with obviously the furore concerning the collapse of Carillion and so on. And the reality is whenever an outsourcing project hasn't gone well, it can very quickly get publicity without fairly representing all of those deals which have gone perfectly adequately or even very well, which don't generate the same kind of publicity. So some of it, I think, is driven from a need to kind of reinvent itself. I think also there's lots of clients who will now talk about outsourcing as being transformative. So it's not just a question of lift and shift what we did previously and have it done for a cheaper price, but rather embrace the fact that there is a third party who has capabilities to engender change within our organization, which we simply don't have, and therefore we need the other party to come in, take control of what we do and transform it. And there's a number of projects I can think of at the moment which are more described as a transformation program or a next generation program and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? When you think of digital, and we'll come on to talk about digital transformation in a second and what it entails. When we first started getting involved in it many years ago, I thought it would lead to a lot more insourcing, agile teams working more or more akin to working through with colleagues or different types of service provision. But actually, the outsourcing industry is still growing, and in fact, digital transformation has been a real demand generator for outsourcing or service providers and systems integrators. generally. So again, as we were talking actually before we started recording, I know you're busier than ever. So is digital transformation and all things digital increased demand for your services?
Yes, very much so. I think what we have seen a drop off is, let's say, the more traditional data center infrastructure management type deals. I mean, unequivocally, those are far fewer than they ever used to be for obvious reasons. But that's been more than made up from an uptick in terms of these digital transformation programs, as the continued expansion of BPO, both in terms of numbers of deals and the scope of what is being seen as now being capable of being entrusted to third parties. And the digital transformation imperative is huge. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that technology is eating the world and is impacting every single sector. And organizations have truly woken up to the fact that they need to transform the ways in which they engage with their customers. They need to re-engineer their supply chains and their modes of operation. And that technology is the way to do that. But the reality is that most companies are not truly skilled or resourced to do that change solely on their own. And therefore, the demand for them to get services from outside assistance is massive. And along with that is, and unfortunately this comes down to the demands placed upon advisors, a lot of the likes of ISG and DLA, is it all needs to be done yesterday.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, I suppose it's a bit like the term outsourcing changing. When you think of the outsourcers changing, and most of the pure play Indian heritage providers or the large global providers have become part digital agency, part outsourcer, part systems integrator. They've been acquiring digital agencies. They've improved their creative skills so that they can transform customer journeys, understand what the technology is required to deliver those digital transformations, and then deliver them through an offshore and onshore model using digital technology, using RPA, using AI. So they've gone through a huge transformation themselves from outsourcers to digital transformation partners, right?
Yeah, completely. And I think I often refer to the Indian heritage providers in particular going through a crucial pivot phase, because some of them who were a bit longer in the tooth in the IT sense were originally perhaps product companies or maybe software companies on the back of the Y2K bug, and they pivoted to become services companies in the early noughties when they could use the labor arbitrage advantage to run on outsourcing that way. The second big pivot they're doing now is to become solution companies. So actually to embrace the ability to use the cloud to deliver services in a very different way. And the ones who fail to really embrace that and make that change, to be blunt, are probably the ones who won't be here in a few years.
Exactly. Do you? We've seen a much more fragmented industry with lots of new niche specialist service providers in digital and in AI and in blockchain or whatever the new technology is. And so as well as the existing service providers having to reinvent themselves, as we've said, there's now all of these new entrants as well, and which clients can engage with on an as a service basis or on a platform basis. So the industry, the supply side of the industry has become fragmented, incredibly competitive, and the level of choice and complexity, I suppose, but the level of choice from a client perspective has gone right up. And so number of deals that we're seeing in the market are increasing, and the duration of those deals is shortening, and the types of contracts that are required to manage them are potentially more flexible. So are you seeing that sort of that same dynamic of more shorter deals in the market with different service providers?
I think it varies a little bit depending upon the nature of the services in question. But if I can use an example of one sector in particular where that is absolutely the case, it would be fintech.
Yeah.
So if you think about of the big banks, in many ways, I think they can be likened to a massive blue whale who've been swimming serenely through the financial services oceans for years and years, making lots of money and being very successful. Then into the market come these fintechs, which are, to stretch the analogy, they're like little piranhas. Yeah. And each one of them individually is not going to do too much harm to the blue whale. But when you have a horde of them descending on the blue whale all at the same time, they obviously are very hungry and they eat the business of these blue whales very quickly. Now, I think that these smarter big banks have realized that they can't therefore ignore these little fintechs. And equally, they're not necessarily best placed to compete with them because they're not as nimble, they're not as quick thinking as some of these fintechs are. And so the better advised big financial institutions, and I think there's lots of examples of this, are looking more to collaborate and work with the fintechs. Now, from a contractor perspective, that puts a very different challenge in their minds, because most of these big banks, and act for many of them, have got traditionally a lot of bargaining power. And that means that when they've been negotiating against the likes of the big boys in the technology world, like the Accentures, IBMs, HCLs, and Infosys, and what have you, they've been used to putting in place complex contracts, which, as you say, are very protective, got all the bells and whistles on them, and take a lot of time to negotiate. Now, that simply isn't going to work when you're working with fintechs. Yeah. Partially because they're used to working very, very quickly, and usually the business demands to implement their solutions is likewise, like as of yesterday, please. So you haven't got the time to go through that long-winded contract process. But equally, if you took a step back, you think, well, why would we bother putting in place this contract which has got all of these indemnities, termination right, damages claims, what have you, when if something goes wrong, they're not going to have the means to pay us anyway.
Yeah.
So instead, you have this focus, a bit like you were saying earlier on, to collaborate. How can we have a different type of contract structure which is going to enable us to properly collaborate, rather than seeing these third parties as just a kind of competitor for us to, or a pure supplier for us to work with.
Yeah, but putting those contracts in place must have become more complex, right? So more tailored and more personalized to each individual client, and having collaborative relationships between different service providers working together and different client and service providers working together is, I think, has become more complex. And then if you think about, let's say, an agile working environment where you have co-collaboration on a product or a service, and you get to a minimal viable product without many requirements, you don't really know what the end solution is going to look like when you start building it. How on earth are you contracting for that? What sort of best practices are you seeing in those scenarios?
Well, I mean, the use of agile, I think, is a really, really topical point from a contraction point of view, because the simple and honest truth is I see a lot of really, really badly put together arrangements involving the use of agile technologies. And I can tell you that on my desk right now, I've got 2 failing projects, which I can trace largely back to the fact that the parties who put them together hadn't really understood what the contractual difference would be of working on an agile basis. Yeah. So it is a mindset for the lawyers. I mean, lawyers, but naturally we like certainty as our profession. That's what we're driven to try to achieve. As you rightly say, agile is not about certainty. Agile is about, as the name suggests, flexibility, change, the ability to flex. And the contract documents need to reflect that. You can't have a contract which is talking all about, I'm going to have delivery of X by date Y, because that's just not the way that it works. Now, I think that the market is adapting. I think reality, although agile in some senses is old wine into new bottles in terms of rapid application development methodologies having been around for a long time, but the size of the projects that are being done on an agile basis, their prevalence, I think, is definitely all new news, and we are seeing better contracts created to deal with that. So as you point out, the idea of there being a minimum viable product, so like the kernel of functionality, which can in any event be delivered within a certain budget and within a certain time, and then agile being used to work out what further bells and whistles can be delivered around that. That is a better understood contracting process now than would have been the case before. The realization that instead of just applying penalties and liabilities for failures to achieve a certain outcome, in actual fact, you use the commercials of the deal to incentivize behaviors in a different way. All of that sophistication is developing in the market, perhaps not as quickly as one might like, but it's certainly developing.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think we are very early days of agile, and agile, the concepts of course have been around for a long time, particularly from a software development perspective. But now it's just a way of working, right? Working in an agile way, moving from plan, build, run into agile sprints. It's just a completely different approach, and it's really refreshing actually to work with organizations who want to be much more agile, want to be much more nimble, want to get things done more quickly, don't accept that getting releases out to production should take a couple of months because it has to go to a different department and go through different tests and go through a release pattern, because we as consumers, if it's a direct to consumer, demand more, and whether we are consumers in a business to business where we want a service from an in-sourced or outsourced service provider, or whether we are consumers consuming a product from a big bank on our mobile app or whatever it might be. We want convenience, we want efficiency, we want things right now. And I think it's refreshing that large organizations are now going through the upheaval of moving from something they've been doing for years and years in this plan, build, run, separate silos, different ways of working and handoffs between different departments, to shaking it all up and restructuring it in a new operating model to deliver things in a more agile way for customers using technology. So it's refreshing. I'm very glad we're getting there, but I still think it's got a long way to go.
I think that's right. And I think in fact, digital transformation is all about ripping up how things have been done in the past and reimagining it rather than trying to tinker around the edges. And there's no reason at all why that shouldn't also apply to our thinking as to the sourcing and procurement process as much as the solutions themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'd agree. What about the world of automation and robotic process automation and AI and cognitive and intelligent OCR and all of the good things that go with this brave new world that everybody's talking about and excited about? Are you seeing much demand for those types of projects? And do you think that you will see increased technology spend and increased demand for all things that can be included in the sort of nebulous term that is AI?
So already for those deals that are still being done on, we'll call it a classical outsource basis, or which would still be described as an outsourcing deal, I don't see very many, if any of them, which now don't incorporate a significant RPA stroke AI related financial bonus, in the sense of suppliers, in some cases, just making a bet that they will be able to reduce inefficiencies and streamline processes over the contract term by reason of the use of better AI and automation, and therefore reducing their pricing across the contract term accordingly. So it's definitely here. Its impact is being felt, and in some cases, there's a big BPO project we were working on last year where over across the 5-year term, the supplier was going to reduce the pricing by nigh on 49%. So that kind of cost reduction, really, really significant. And most of that was going to come from AI, not labor arbitrage benefits, as perhaps might have historically been the case.
Yeah,
I think the interesting thing is we're starting to see more implementations which are purely AI based. So it's not AI or RPA as an enabler, but rather the implementation of an AI solution on a standalone basis. That, I think, is going to really be a pattern going forward. I'm a great believer in the pace of change engendered by the capabilities inherent in the application of Moore's law, and therefore things that we now only think as being potentially achievable will become day-to-day realities far faster than we ever think they would do.
Yeah,
and I've got no doubt that it just as people are now thinking AI, well, it could have a seismic impact upon our day-to-day lives and the lives of commercial organizations. I don't think it could. I think it will, and will do sooner than we think. And so I would be very, very surprised if this time next year the level of pure play AI implementations that we're doing is not doubled or tripled.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it will be, as you said, it sometimes doesn't come as quickly as we think it might, but then it sort of catches up with us, and suddenly before we realize it, there's AI embedded into just about every piece of technology that we work with. I wonder what it will do to our particular industry. So professional services and legal services, and there's been talk about how intelligent OCR or artificial intelligence in all of its forms will transform the legal profession, and you see the discovery process being automated with machines being able to run through contracts and strip out particular terms. Has that come as quickly as you predicted it might? Are you still having to spend an awful lot of time during the discovery process reviewing documents, or are you using AI type tools now, and what do you think is going to happen in the next few years?
So within the legal profession, it's perhaps not immediately apparent to people who are not lawyers, but AI in its basic forms, I would say, is very, very widely used. I mean, you use the example of litigation and discovery process. That's a very, very good one because, as you can imagine, for complex commercial disputes in particular, when we've had this explosion of documentation because of the advent of email, whereas 30 years ago, that kind of dispute might have involved going through maybe 1 million documents, which would have been a very expensive and time-consuming process. Now it probably means going through 10 million documents. So the only way that you can do that in any kind of cost-efficient manner is through the use of software. So an AI initially as a very basic search tool, but then increasingly as something more machine learning, because it starts to spot patterns and combinations of words, is key. And if I was to go to into the litigation departments and the corporate departments, where again with big M&A transactions, there's a similar very large document review requirement in the context of due diligence, and they use those kind of basic AI tools on a day-to-day basis. So I think as it's public, we're big users of Kira as an example. I think where perhaps we haven't got to yet is the use of AI beyond process improvement and searching tools. And I think that is the next frontier, because when people talk about AI in this context, we're not really talking about cognitive ability. What we're talking about is the application of brute processing power to do things which look like decisions are being made, but is all data driven. But I think that nonetheless, for the purposes of the delivery of legal services, clients, I think, will be willing to accept increasingly decisions which can be clearly seen as being data driven without the necessity for thinking that it's been linked then to the exercise of intellectual thought. So take an example, which is something that we're openly looking at now. If you think about why a client would come to me at the moment for advice on an outsourcing deal, it's not necessarily because they like my turn of phrase or they think I'm particularly well dressed or what have you. They may think that I'm quite a good negotiator, but in large part, it's because they know that I've got a knowledge of the market and market norms and potential compromises that could get around problems because of my experience to date. But I'm only one person. My experience is only my deals, even if I may have done more of them than your average Joe. And my memory is also imperfect. I like to think I've got a good memory, but I won't remember without checking the exact drafting of every single contract that I've ever done. Now, if you imagine instead you could implement a system which has simultaneous access not just to the records of contracts done by one lawyer or even one group of lawyers or even one firm of lawyers, but a wider database which pulls in examples of contracts from potentially tens, if not hundreds of organizations, public databases, etc., and it's got that brute processing power to be able to analyze contract clauses based upon a set of criteria that you're putting in about the type of deal. And you then turn around to a client and say, well, you've got a choice. You can either spend the next 6 months negotiating with his supplier, and yes, maybe you'll get things a little bit more tweaked towards your way, but it will take you 6 months and it'll cost you X £100,000, or you can press this button and it will create for you as a starting point, not for all of the contract, but the vast majority of it, action endpoint, which reflects the positions reached in all these thousands of other market contracts. What do you want to do? I'll be willing to bet that there will be a number of clients who will say, you know what, as long as it's market standard, as long as it's covering all of the essential bases, I'd rather press that button and save myself all that time and concentrate instead upon doing the things which are genuinely unique to the deal around the commercials and the scope of services. So that is the logical next stage for the legal profession, and in common with many other industry sectors, whilst that may appear to be an approach of cannibalizing the work that we do, if we do not do it to ourselves, someone else will do it to us. And that may not be another law firm. It could be another one of the big tech providers. So in many ways, I would say that the biggest competitors for the legal profession over the next 10 years will not be each other. It won't even be the big four accounting firms. It's likely to be people like Microsoft, IBM, and Google.
Yes, absolutely. Google law or Amazon law. I know I recognize all of that dynamic, even in our industry as well. We're, as you know, technology research and advice, and we've developed many platforms over the years, and those platforms are becoming increasingly mature and increasingly data driven. So if it's the service provider and customer performance measurements, we capture data on all of that. If it's number of outsourcing deals that have been done in the market per industry, per type, with all of the commercial terms, we're able to benchmark and provide real-time data on the market. Same with types of contracts that are being put in place, same with service levels and performance levels that are being adhered to. All of that is in a platform for us. So you can imagine that it won't be that long if you take your world and our world combined, and that's all in a AI-driven algorithmic platform for a client to say, well, this is the type of service I want. I want a cloud service. It's infrastructure. I want this type of delivery model. And they put those requirements into the platform. Out pops pricing, out pops service provider, and out pops standard contractual terms. It doesn't leave a lot for you or I to be doing to add too much value to that process. So I think, as we've been saying in the world of RPA, we're freeing up people from doing mundane, routine tasks to concentrate on higher value activities. I think the same might be said for technology research, advice, and technology law in the not too distant future.
Completely. I mean, it would be naive to think that the legal services profession would be immune from the same kind of transformative pressures that are affecting all of the other sectors in the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. A really, really interesting conversation, and I think we could carry on for hours. But I'm going to stop it there and ask you, if you wouldn't mind, the 5 standard questions that we ask every guest on our podcast series.
I will do my best if they're not too difficult.
We'll take a look back at the end of the year and see what answers we've got, see what commonality we got. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, which technology has had the biggest influence on your career to date, and why?
Right. I think I will say email. And it's probably worth explaining why, because this one is one which is very specific to me as a lawyer. So if you can imagine the time when I qualified here, nigh on 30 years ago, the existence of a lawyer in those days was I would get a big blue book brought to me every morning, which would have the letters that had been sent to me by another law firm, which had to have come under the eye of my supervising partner before they reached me. I would then dictate on a little recorder what my response would be. That would go to a secretary or come back, and I'd correct it, having time to think about it, and maybe correct it because I had some other ideas. Then would go into a book to go underneath the partner's eye. He or she would read it, amend it. Finally, that letter would go out, and then obviously we'd have a few days before that process would result in a letter coming back to me. There's a lot of thinking time involved there. There's a lot of ability to correct any errors that you might have made, for things to change in the meantime. So it's quite actually a risk-managed approach. And obviously the fact that partners were seeing everything that came in and goes out also was a significant risk mitigant. But I can vividly remember the first days, even the very basic one-to-one with a client link email kind of came in. And rapid development. Then we actually had Lotus Notes initially, and then now obviously everything with Outlook. All of that has fundamentally changed. The speed with which we're expected to react, to turn things round, to complete things has fundamentally changed. You have no thinking time. If you haven't responded to within an hour, it's a question, why not? Why haven't you responded? What else were you doing with your lives other than just waiting to respond to my email? And it's not just therefore that the speed of life has increased exponentially, but that relationship with your client, that kind of immediacy with which they expect to be able to deal with you, has shifted completely. And so therefore, in terms of the impact upon my life and the life of others in the legal profession, I don't think there is any other single technology which would have had as big an impact as email.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I'm like you. I remember using email for the first time and realizing that I could attach a document of some type and send it to multiple recipients at the same time was mind blowing back then. And I also think if you think of millennials, who I think of my teenage children who are going into the workforce, one of the biggest changes I think they will find is that they will have to use email, certainly in the next few years, hopefully not for in the next decade, but they don't use email. Kids don't communicate using email. They use Snapchat, they use different applications, they use WhatsApp, and then we expect them to go into a corporate environment and basically spend 50% of their time responding to email. And I think it's going to be a big culture shock for them.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there is an interesting question as to whether or not, as part of this next shift, that organizations will move off email. I mean, there are some examples. I mean, Atos, I think, is very often cited as being an organization which has tried to wean itself off email towards using in-house versions of the business adaptations of Facebook.
Certainly internally, yeah.
And maybe that will be the way that we will all go.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great answer. Second question. What technology promised much and delivered little? So in your experience, what did you have great hopes for in the world of technology, but has been disappointing in terms of what it's delivered?
Right, I think here I'm going to go back in time a little bit, and it may sound odd when I first answer, so I'll explain. So I would say video calls. Now, video calls. Now, everybody takes it for granted that when you pick up your phone, if you want to do FaceTime, whatever, and see the person you're speaking to, that's absolutely fine. And with 5G just around the corner, there won't even be any lingering jitter or lag in the signal. Yeah. But if I cast my mind back, one of the clients I used to do a huge amount of work for when they first set up in the UK was what was then H3G, now 3. So if you remember when the 3G networks, the licenses for them were first let, Hutchison Whampoa spent several billions on getting one of those licenses and started with, I think, 3 people, of which one of was a lawyer who I knew very well, hence the reason why we were appointed to help them to develop all of the IT and do all the contracting, set up their networks. Now, what I remember is the big thing that they were pinning their hopes on as being the means by which they would break into the market was video calls. The fact that using the 3G network, they were going to be the first telephone company to offer their subscribers the ability to see the person that they were calling. And it was a big thing. Everyone was really excited about it. And obviously, the first time it was ever enabled for the likes of you and me. And yet, when the technology was launched, whilst it was available, I mean, you needed to be within with 3G signal, but whilst the technology was available, people didn't want it. The reality was that the quality wasn't quite good enough, and it was just too early. People were not ready to embrace the technology. So it ended up that 3 competed on the more traditional grounds of slashing call prices and cost for text, etc. But it was a very good example to me at that time that a technology which seemed to offer the means for a company to break into a market and differentiate itself, just was not geared to the needs or true desires of its consumer base. And if you think about it, there's probably lots of other technologies which you could say the same thing about, that they've got the capability. It would be fantastic if people wanted them, but we're not really quite ready for it yet.
Yeah, exactly. There was a little bit ahead of its time. I remember those big Cisco walls, and you went into boardrooms and the idea was you'd be able to see everybody from around the world on a video conference. You got very excited, but the experience didn't quite live up to the expectations. Even now, we still struggle with some video calls through different applications that we use. So I think that's a really, really good answer. Third question. What technology or which technology do you think will have the biggest influence on business over the next 10 years and why? Maybe we've discussed this a little bit, but what do you think over the next decade is going to have the biggest impact on business?
I don't think there is any doubt on this one, in actual fact, that it's AI. I mean, blockchain, I think, has promise, but I think behind the scenes, whilst that will be implemented, I don't think people will see the impact of that perhaps as immediately and as viscerally as they will with AI. And I think the other key reason for why AI will have a bigger impact is because it is going to decimate the workforce. I mean, there are utopian and very positive aspects of AI, I'm sure, and it's going to make our lives much better in many, many ways, from healthcare through to the way in which we communicate with each other and have services delivered to us. But it will also slash and burn a whole series of current jobs without any immediate answers as to what the people who would have done those jobs are going to do in the future. So, I mean, just take one obvious example. I think the single biggest area of employment in the US is truck drivers. Now, with AI and driverless vehicles, there will be no requirement for truck drivers. It's only a question of when. And you've got to ask the question, well, what are all those people who would have been truck drivers or taxi drivers or what have you, what are they going to do? So with the super accelerating capabilities of AI and it's the reaching of those tendrils into lots more ways of our lives, which we can currently, I suspect, only just imagine, it's going to be transformative. And we're still really in the early. To use another analogy I use quite often, it's the frog in the saucepan. It doesn't notice the water boiling around until it's soporific and boils to death. I think we are that frog in that saucepan when it comes to the application of AI.
Yes, interesting, isn't it? The next decade or two are going to be fascinating in terms of how AI develops and whether it's, as you say, it's a utopian or a dystopian view. And lots of people have polarizing views on AI. I'm sure you've watched the Black Mirror series, which it's been on TV, which is just fascinating looks of how different bits of technology will change our lives, and sort of a forward-looking view of what could potentially happen. You think, wow, that really brings it to life.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think that is a fantastic series in terms of the way where technology can have perhaps less positive impacts on our lives. I mean, I would say, look, there's no doubt it's going to have some fantastic gains into examples in healthcare. Is just one example of the use of AI to improve diagnostic techniques and genuinely keep people alive. It's hard to deny the benefit that will bring. But I think the effect it will have upon our balance in society, where we move for a lot of people to short working weeks because we just don't need as many people doing the jobs because more of it's done by technology, and some people who will increasingly be just excluded from the workplace altogether, and that's just going to be an interesting impact upon society.
Yeah, absolutely. And how we then look after those people and what that means from tax regimes and etc. is probably a future podcast episode in its own right.
Yeah, I think it probably is.
So my penultimate question for you, what's your favorite technology gadget and why?
I'm not a massive gadget freak. I mean, I haven't got a Fitbit or anything of that nature. I've got increasingly using Alexa as a little, and trying to play around as to how much I can teach it in my room. But probably the one device which I always fall back to is my trusty iPad, in the sense that the fact that I find myself on the road so much traveling around, I think that the beauty of having that device, which is your conduit through to the internet, an entertainment device, a source of information, the link through to your business world as well. Sometimes you forget it's thing which is not much more the size of the book. Absolutely is a lifesaver wherever I am, anywhere in the world. So it's not perhaps the sexiest answer. I'll probably say my iPad is probably my favorite device.
No, I mean, it's amazing to think that we take iPads and iPhones and tablets in general for granted now, just as these technologies that we use every day, that 10 years ago didn't exist. Probably 10 years ago, before I got my first iPad. Just incredible, really. Think again, Moore's law and exponential growth. 10 years time, and what the iPad of the next decade will look like.
Yep.
No, good answer. And my final question: who is your technology hero, and why?
Right, I had to think about this one quite heavily. I would say, although it is another lawyer, somebody who is a lawyer very, very steeped in the technology world, there's this guy called Mike Cunningham, who is the general counsel now for Red Hat, where I used to be roomies when I was at PwC, and he became the general counsel for PricewaterhouseCoopers on the management consulting side before they were bought by IBM, and then moved across to Red Hat. Now, the reason why it would be Mike is that I learned a lot from Mike, not just in terms of technical lawyering skills, although he was an excellent technical lawyer, but in terms of the commercial application of the law and the realization that you had to really understand the sector if you were going to be a good lawyer. So it wouldn't be enough just to know the law, but you really, really needed to get under the skin of the way that the technology worked and the business drivers for the organizations. So if taking Red Hat as an example, I remember actually interviewing Mike for a video presentation we were doing to our own partners conference, which was talking about sectorial knowledge and its importance. And he used his company as an example. So Red Hat, as everybody probably knows, is probably the leading open source services company, valued based upon its impending acquisition by IBM at multiple billions of dollars. And Mike was saying that if a lawyer comes to me and is talking to me about their knowledge of the software industry, but is talking about proprietary ownership and licensing models, even though they may be a fantastic software licensing lawyer, they are of no use to me whatsoever, because they don't understand the dynamics of the open source specific issues that will absolutely determine whether my company lives or dies. Yeah. And it's that kind of appreciation that I developed with Mike for many years when he was both working in the UK and then back in the US, that really kind of drove me to kind of get under the skin from a sectorial perspective of many of the clients that I work with, and probably led to the fact that now within DLA, one of the hats that I wear is as co-chair of our global technology sector. So that's kind of, I guess, been a driver for where I've ended up within my professional career, as well as just being something which just kept me awake at night reading things.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, being a generalist is no good anymore, right? We need to have industries specifics. We really need to understand what our clients are going through before we can really add any professional advice. I think a great answer. So Kit, thank you ever so much for being part of our Smart Talks podcast. It was a fascinating conversation. Great to chat as ever. Really appreciate your support. So yeah, big thank you on behalf of ISG.
No trouble at all, Barry, and all best with the rest of the series.
Thank you.